Delphine Whitmore had perfected the art of being invisible with the precision of a master craftsman. At Jefferson High School, she moved through the sprawling hallways like a wraith, her slight frame and deliberately quiet demeanor making her nearly unnoticeable to the 2,000 students who filled these corridors each day. Her auburn hair, the color of autumn leaves catching the last rays of sunlight, hung in loose waves around her pale, heart-shaped face. The locks fell just past her shoulders, often partially obscuring her features when she deliberately let them cascade forward like a protective curtain. Behind wire-rimmed glasses that she had specifically chosen for their understated appearance, her green eyes held an intelligence that most people never bothered to notice, sharp and observant like polished emeralds. She preferred it that way, or at least she had convinced herself she did, during the long, lonely months since transferring to this massive institution. Her oversized sweaters, carefully selected from thrift stores across 3 different neighborhoods to ensure no one from school would recognize the origins, seemed to swallow her small frame whole. The fabric hung loose around her shoulders and torso, creating an illusion of frailty that was as calculated as it was effective. Beneath the layers of concealing clothing, however, lay a secret that would have shocked every person who had ever dismissed her as just another awkward teenager struggling to find her place in the brutal social ecosystem of public high school. What nobody at Jefferson High knew, what she guarded more carefully than any diary or family secret, was that Delphine had spent the last 8 years training in mixed martial arts at her uncle's gym on the other side of town. Every evening after school, while her classmates were grinding through football practice under the harsh glare of stadium lights, gossiping in cluttered bedrooms, or wandering the fluorescent-lit corridors of the local mall in search of identity and belonging, Delphine was in a completely different world. She was perfecting her strikes with methodical precision, learning submission holds that could incapacitate grown men, and building a strength that her baggy clothes completely concealed. The gym itself was a temple to controlled violence, housed in a converted warehouse that had once manufactured automotive parts. The space retained the industrial character of its previous life, with exposed steel beams stretching across a ceiling painted flat black to hide the maze of ductwork and electrical conduits. The walls were lined with heavy bags that had been pounded into submission by thousands of fists and feet, their leather surfaces worn smooth and dark with sweat and impact. Speed bags hung from adjustable platforms, their rapid-fire rhythms creating a percussion soundtrack that echoed through the space from morning until night. The mats covering the training floor were thick and resilient, designed to absorb the impact of bodies thrown with considerable force, their surface scarred by years of intense practice sessions. Her uncle Marcus, a former UFC fighter whose professional career had ended not from lack of skill, but from a series of injuries that had accumulated like compound interest over 8 years in the octagon, had taken her under his wing, after her parents' bitter divorce had left her mother struggling to build her daughter's shattered confidence. Marcus Rodriguez had been a middleweight contender during the sport's early expansion into mainstream entertainment, fighting under the nickname The Technician for his methodical, scientific approach to combat. His record of 14 wins and 6 losses didn't tell the whole story of a fighter who had faced some of the most dangerous men in the world and emerged with his dignity intact. The divorce had been particularly brutal, one of those protracted legal battles that consumed family resources and emotional energy like a hungry fire. Delphine's father, a corporate lawyer who specialized in mergers and acquisitions, had decided that his family was no longer compatible with his vision of success. The proceedings had dragged on for nearly 2 years, with Delphine caught in the middle of custody disputes, financial negotiations, and the slow disintegration of everything she had thought was permanent in her life. Her mother, Sarah, had been a stay-at-home parent for most of Delphine's childhood, leaving her unprepared for suddenly needing to support herself and her daughter on an entry-level salary at a non-profit organization. Marcus had watched his sister struggle with single parenthood while his niece seemed to disappear into herself, becoming quieter and more withdrawn with each passing month. He had seen the same thing happen to other kids in his gym, young people who had been damaged by circumstances beyond their control and were searching for something solid to hold on to. When he suggested that Delphine might benefit from martial arts training, Sarah had initially been skeptical. The idea of her quiet, bookish daughter learning to fight seemed counterintuitive, almost cruel. But Marcus had been persuasive, explaining that martial arts weren't about creating fighters. They were about building confidence, discipline, and self-respect. He had seen transformation happen countless times in his gym, had watched timid teenagers develop into confident young adults through the methodical process of learning to control their bodies and minds. The physical skills were just one component of a much larger philosophical framework that emphasized personal responsibility, respect for others, and the kind of inner strength that couldn't be shaken by external circumstances. The first few months of training had been challenging in ways that Delphine hadn't expected. The physical demands were significant, but the mental aspects were even more difficult. Marcus had been careful to teach her not just the technical aspects of fighting, but the mental discipline and philosophical framework that came with legitimate martial arts training. He had seen too many talented fighters destroy their lives because they couldn't control their aggression outside the ring, had watched promising young athletes become bullies themselves when they confused physical capability with personal worth. He was absolutely determined that Delphine would never follow that destructive path. "Real power comes from knowing you don't have to use it," he would say during their training sessions, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Anyone can throw a punch when they're angry. It takes real strength to walk away when you know you could win." These conversations often took place during the cool-down periods after particularly intense training sessions, when Delphine's muscles were exhausted and her mind was open to the deeper lessons that Marcus considered more important than any physical technique. The training itself had been methodical and comprehensive, designed to build not just fighting skills, but character. Marcus had developed a curriculum that drew from multiple disciplines, each chosen for specific benefits that extended far beyond combat application. They had started with basic conditioning and flexibility work, hours spent building the foundation of strength and mobility that would support everything else. Delphine learned to push through discomfort, to maintain focus when her body wanted to quit, to find reserves of determination she hadn't known existed. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu had been introduced gradually, beginning with basic positions and movements before progressing to more complex techniques. The art of ground fighting required a different kind of thinking, a chess-like approach to human combat, where leverage and technique could overcome significant disadvantages in size and strength. Marcus had been particularly insistent on this discipline, knowing that most real confrontations ended up on the ground and that understanding grappling would give Delphine options that most people never developed. The training sessions were intense and methodical, often lasting 3 hours on weekday evenings and longer on weekends. Delphine would arrive at the gym still wearing her school clothes, the transformation from invisible student to dedicated athlete marked by the simple act of changing into training gear. The process of wrapping her hands, lacing her gloves, and stepping onto the mats represented a daily metamorphosis that she came to cherish. Muay Thai had followed, the ancient art of 8 limbs that utilized fists, elbows, knees, and shins in devastating combination. The conditioning required for this discipline was particularly brutal, involving repeated impact training that gradually hardened bones and deadened nerve endings. Delphine learned to throw kicks that could shatter boards, to deliver knee strikes with bone-crushing force, to use her elbows like bladed weapons. But more importantly, she learned the mental toughness required to absorb punishment and continue fighting, the kind of psychological resilience that carried over into every aspect of life. Traditional boxing had rounded out her striking education, teaching her the sweet science of hand-to-hand combat that had been refined over centuries of competition. The footwork, head movement and combinations became second nature through thousands of repetitions. She learned to read opponents' intentions in the subtle shifts of their weight and the positioning of their shoulders. Her reflexes developed to the point where she could react to threats before her conscious mind had fully processed them. By the time she reached Jefferson High School at the beginning of her junior year, Delphine had developed a fighting style that emphasized efficiency over flashiness, substance over style. She could have easily held her own against most adults, let alone the teenage bullies who would soon make her life miserable. Her punches carried the kind of devastating power that came from years of proper technique development. Her kicks were precise and devastating. Her grappling skills would have impressed professional fighters, yet none of her classmates had any idea that the quiet girl in oversized sweaters possessed skills that could incapacitate multiple attackers in seconds. The decision to transfer to Jefferson had been purely financial. The private academy where Delphine had spent her freshman and sophomore years cost nearly $20,000 annually, a sum that had been manageable when her parents were married and her father's income supported their comfortable suburban lifestyle. After the divorce, with her mother earning barely $30,000 a year and receiving minimal child support due to her father's skilled manipulation of legal loopholes, that tuition became impossible to sustain. Jefferson High School was everything that Delphine's previous institution was not. Where St. Catherine's Academy had been small, intimate, and carefully controlled, Jefferson was massive, chaotic, and brutal in its social dynamics. The building itself was an architectural monument to 1970s institutional design, all concrete and steel with narrow windows that seemed designed to keep students in rather than let light flow in. The hallways were wide enough to accommodate the flood of students that moved between classes, but the sheer volume of people created a constant sense of barely controlled chaos. The student population was diverse in every sense of the word, drawing from neighborhoods across the district and representing every economic stratum from genuinely wealthy families to those struggling with poverty. This diversity, which should have been a strength, instead created a complex hierarchy based on subtle markers of social status that new students like Delphine struggled to navigate. The unwritten rules were numerous and unforgiving, and violations were punished with social ostracism or worse. The bullying had started almost immediately when Delphine transferred to Jefferson at the beginning of the semester, like predators sensing wounded prey. Moving from the protected environment of a small private school to this massive public institution had been jarring enough without the additional challenges that came with being obviously different. Her quiet nature, pale complexion, and slight build made her an easy target for students who were looking for someone to push around, someone they could use to establish their own position in the school's brutal pecking order. The initial assessment had been swift and merciless. Within the first week, word had spread through the invisible networks that governed teenage social interaction that there was fresh meat available, a new girl who didn't seem to have connections or protection. The evaluation was conducted with the methodical thoroughness of a military intelligence operation, with different groups testing her responses to various forms of provocation. Some students tried verbal probes, casual insults delivered with plausible deniability that allowed them to gauge her confidence and willingness to defend herself. Others attempted physical intimidation, the subtle shoulder checks and accidental collisions that were designed to establish dominance without crossing the line into actionable assault. Still others observed her reactions to social isolation, noting how she responded to being excluded from conversations and activities. Troy Brennan emerged as the alpha predator in this ecosystem through a combination of natural aggression, social intelligence, and the kind of casual cruelty that came naturally to those who had never faced real consequences for their actions. He was a stocky quarterback with bleached hair that he maintained with obsessive attention to detail, and a perpetual sneer that had become his signature expression sometime during middle school. His physical presence was imposing enough to intimidate most students, but it was his psychological warfare that made him truly dangerous. Troy ruled the school's social hierarchy with the efficiency of a medieval warlord, maintaining power through a careful balance of rewards and punishments that kept potential rivals in line and potential victims isolated. He had an intuitive understanding of group dynamics and social psychology that he used to manipulate situations to his advantage. Students who aligned themselves with him were protected and elevated within the social structure. Those who opposed him or simply failed to show proper deference were systematically destroyed. His two constant companions were carefully chosen for complementary skills that enhanced the group's effectiveness. Jackson Pike was a lanky basketball player whose height and athletic ability provided physical intimidation, but whose real value lay in his complete lack of empathy. Where Troy's cruelty was calculated and purposeful, Jackson's was casual and reflexive, like breathing. His dead eyes and perpetual half-smile suggested someone who found genuine pleasure in others' suffering, making him particularly effective at psychological torture. Becca Reeves completed the triumvirate with a combination of social intelligence and vicious creativity that made her perhaps the most dangerous of the three. Her pretty face and cheerleader status provided perfect camouflage for a personality that was genuinely sadistic. She specialized in the kind of social warfare that left no visible marks, but could destroy a victim's reputation and self-esteem with surgical precision. Her weapons were rumors, exclusion, and the kind of subtle humiliation that adults rarely recognized as bullying. Together, they had identified Delphine as the perfect target within her first week at Jefferson. She was new, which meant she had no established social connections or protection. She was obviously different, with her thrift store clothes and quiet demeanor marking her as an outsider. Most importantly, she appeared weak and unlikely to fight back, making her a low-risk target for high-impact harassment. The harassment had started small, but was clearly calculated, designed to test her responses and establish the parameters of what they could get away with. The first incident occurred during her second week at Jefferson, when Troy had accidentally shoulder-checked her near the chemistry lab during the chaotic period between classes. The collision had been perfectly timed and executed, occurring in a crowded hallway where witnesses could be explained away and the action could be disguised as an accident. The impact sent her textbooks and carefully organized notes flying across the polished linoleum floor, scattering her materials among the feet of dozens of passing students. As she scrambled to collect her papers before they were trampled or kicked away, Troy had stood over her with that characteristic sneer, making loud comments about how some people just don't know how to handle themselves, and maybe you should watch where you're going. The psychological impact of the incident was far greater than the physical inconvenience. Delphine found herself kneeling on the floor while dozens of students stepped around her, some accidentally kicking her scattered belongings, while others deliberately ignored her plight. The message was clear. She was beneath notice, unworthy of consideration or assistance. Troy's comments, delivered loud enough for nearby students to hear, established the narrative that she was clumsy and careless, someone who brought problems on herself. The psychological warfare escalated from there with methodical precision. Whispered comments about her thrift store clothes began circulating within days, observations about the slightly worn condition of her shoes and the outdated styles that marked her as economically disadvantaged. Her quiet voice, when teachers called on her in class, became a source of mockery, with students imitating her soft-spoken responses in exaggerated whispers that somehow managed to be louder than normal conversation. The social isolation was perhaps the most effective weapon in their arsenal. Delphine found herself excluded from group projects through a conspiracy of claimed partnerships and full teams. Seats next to her in the cafeteria remained mysteriously empty, even when other tables were crowded. Conversations stopped when she approached, resumed when she passed, the silence itself becoming a form of communication that she was unwelcome. Troy had dubbed her Mouse after she had quietly answered a question in American history class, her voice barely audible from the back row where she always sat. The incident had occurred during a discussion of the Great Depression, when Mr. Davidson had asked for examples of how economic hardship had affected different social classes. Delphine had raised her hand tentatively and offered a thoughtful response about the psychological impact of unemployment on family structures, her voice soft but her analysis sophisticated. Instead of recognizing the quality of her contribution, Troy had seized on her quiet delivery. "What was that, Mouse?" he had called out, his voice cutting through the classroom like a knife. "I don't think anyone can hear you squeaking back there." The nickname had been delivered with such confident cruelty that several students laughed reflexively, and Mr. Davidson had failed to intervene effectively. The nickname stuck like a disease, spreading through the school's social network with viral efficiency. Within a week, even students who didn't actively participate in the bullying were calling her by that name, effectively erasing her real identity and reducing her to nothing more than a timid creature to be pitied or ignored. The transformation of her name into an insult was particularly devastating because it was so comprehensive. She ceased to exist as Delphine Whitmore and became simply Mouse, a diminished version of herself created for Troy's amusement. The nickname became a weapon in itself, deployed with casual cruelty by students who might not have engaged in more direct forms of bullying. It allowed them to participate in her dehumanization without acknowledging that they were being cruel. After all, they were just using a nickname, nothing more. The insidious nature of this psychological attack was that it turned her identity itself into a source of shame. Teachers who should have known better began using the nickname casually, thinking it was just a harmless bit of teenage social dynamics. "Mouse, can you read the next paragraph?" Mrs. Henderson would ask in English class, not realizing she was participating in the systematic dehumanization of one of her students. Each time Delphine heard it, she felt a piece of herself disappearing, replaced by this diminished version that Troy had created for his own amusement. Mrs. Henderson, Delphine's English teacher, had noticed the tension but seemed reluctant to intervene directly. Like many teachers at Jefferson, she had learned to pick her battles carefully, and confronting popular students like Troy rarely ended well for educators. The school's administration was notoriously protective of their athletic programs, and Troy's position as starting quarterback provided him with a level of institutional protection that made teachers hesitant to challenge him directly. The few times Mrs. Henderson had attempted to address the situation, she had been met with innocent confusion from Troy and his friends. They were masters of plausible deniability, able to transform obvious cruelty into innocent misunderstandings whenever adults were watching. Their behavior toward Delphine was carefully calibrated to remain just below the threshold that would trigger administrative intervention. Mr. Caldwell, the gym teacher and assistant football coach, actually seemed to encourage the behavior, chuckling when Troy made cruel jokes during physical education class. His loyalty to the athletic program superseded any concern for individual students, and he viewed Delphine's obvious discomfort as evidence of weakness rather than victimization. During the few times when she was forced to participate in team sports, he made no effort to ensure fair team selection, allowing Troy and his friends to turn every activity into an opportunity for humiliation. The cafeteria was where the worst incidents occurred, and Troy had recognized its potential as a theater for public humiliation early in his campaign against Delphine. Jefferson's massive lunchroom was a social battlefield where hierarchies were enforced through public displays of power and dominance. The space itself was designed for efficiency rather than comfort, with long tables arranged in military precision and a serving line that could feed hundreds of students in each lunch period. The social geography of the cafeteria was as clearly defined as any map, with different groups claiming territory based on complex calculations of status and affiliation. The athletes dominated the central tables, their proximity to the food line and the main entrance marking them as the apex predators of the social ecosystem. Popular non-athletes occupied the surrounding areas, arranged in careful gradations of status that were invisible to adults but clearly understood by every student. Delphine had learned to navigate this dangerous terrain carefully, usually choosing a corner table near the emergency exit where she could eat quickly and escape if necessary. Her lunch routine had become a military operation, timed to avoid the peak periods when Troy's group was most active, and planned to minimize her exposure to potential confrontation. She had even mapped out alternate routes to and from her table, reconnaissance that would have impressed actual military strategists. But Troy and his crew had made even this careful planning ineffective by turning her lunch period into a daily gauntlet of potential humiliation. They had studied her patterns with the same attention to detail that they brought to game planning, identifying vulnerabilities and opportunities for maximum impact with minimal risk of consequences. Last Tuesday had been particularly brutal, an incident that had been planned and executed with devastating precision. Jackson had accidentally tripped her as she carried her lunch tray from the serving line, the timing too perfect and the execution too smooth to be anything other than deliberate. The collision had been orchestrated to occur just as she passed the popular kids' table, ensuring maximum visibility and impact. Her turkey sandwich and chocolate milk went flying across the polished floor, splattering against cheerleaders' shoes, who shrieked in exaggerated disgust that was clearly performed for dramatic effect. The white milk spread across the dark linoleum like spilled paint, carrying bits of lettuce and tomato in its wake. The entire cafeteria erupted in laughter as Delphine scrambled to clean up the mess, her face burning with embarrassment that felt like physical pain. The public nature of the humiliation was the most devastating aspect. Hundreds of students had witnessed her clumsiness, her failure to navigate even the simple task of carrying a lunch tray without incident. The laughter seemed to echo from every corner of the vast room, creating a wall of sound that made escape impossible. She knelt on the floor with paper napkins that quickly became soggy and useless, aware that every second of her desperate cleanup was being observed and judged. Troy had stood over her during the cleanup process, grinning widely as he offered mock sympathy loud enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "Careful there, Mouse. Maybe you need to work on your coordination, or maybe they don't teach you how to walk properly where you come from." The comment was accompanied by snickers from his friends and uncomfortable silence from everyone else, the kind of collective awkwardness that made clear that witnesses understood they were seeing something wrong but were unwilling to intervene. The custodial staff had eventually arrived to help with the cleanup, but their assistance only added to Delphine's humiliation. Being rescued by adults marked her as unable to handle her own problems, further cementing her status as a victim rather than a peer. The janitor, an elderly man named Miguel, who had worked at Jefferson for over 20 years, had been kind, but his very kindness highlighted her helplessness. But it wasn't just the spectacular incidents that wore her down. It was the constant low-level harassment that made every day feel like navigating a minefield where she never knew when the next explosion might occur. Troy would wait for her at her locker between classes, forcing her to be late as he and his friends formed human barriers she had to navigate around. The delays were calculated to be just long enough to make her conspicuously tardy without being serious enough to warrant administrative attention. The psychological impact of these daily confrontations was cumulative and devastating. Delphine found herself planning her routes through the school with the careful attention of a military strategist, mapping out alternate paths that might allow her to avoid her tormentors. She memorized the schedules of Troy's group, timing her movements to minimize the chances of intersection. Her backpack was always packed and ready for quick escapes, and she had identified multiple exits from every classroom in case retreat became necessary. The physical intimidation had escalated gradually, each incident slightly more aggressive than the last, in a carefully calibrated campaign designed to test her limits without crossing lines that might trigger adult intervention. Shoulder checks became harder and more frequent. Books were knocked from her hands with increasing regularity, the accidents becoming so common that other students began to anticipate them. In the crowded hallways between classes, Troy and his friends would form walls that forced Delphine to push past them, always accompanied by jeering comments about her size and apparent weakness. These confrontations were particularly effective because they occurred in public spaces where witnesses were plentiful, but intervention was unlikely. The hallways during class changes were chaotic environments where adult supervision was minimal and the sheer volume of students provided cover for all kinds of misbehavior. Troy had learned to exploit these conditions expertly, timing his harassment to occur when teachers were distracted or absent. The worst part was the way other students reacted to her ongoing torment. Most simply looked away, their relief at not being targets themselves, creating a willful blindness that enabled the abuse to continue. They understood that intervening on her behalf might make them targets as well, and self-preservation overruled any impulse toward compassion or solidarity. Some laughed nervously when they witnessed the harassment, their discomfort manifesting as participation in the cruelty. These students weren't naturally cruel, but the social pressure to align themselves with power was overwhelming. By laughing at Troy's jokes or participating in the mockery, they protected themselves while simultaneously destroying someone else. A few seemed genuinely uncomfortable with what they witnessed, their faces showing clear distress when they saw Delphine being humiliated. But even these potentially sympathetic observers never spoke up, never offered assistance, never reported what they saw to authorities. Their silence was as devastating as active participation, sending the clear message that Delphine was alone and that no one cared enough to take even minimal risks on her behalf. The message was clear and consistent. Delphine was on her own in this hostile environment. No one would help her, no one would protect her, and no one would even acknowledge that what was happening to her was wrong. This isolation was perhaps more damaging than the direct harassment, creating a sense of helplessness and despair that permeated every aspect of her school experience. Despite her extensive training, despite knowing that she could probably handle all three of her tormentors simultaneously without significant difficulty, Delphine continued to endure the abuse in silence. Her uncle's lessons about control and discipline echoed in her mind constantly, reinforcing the philosophical framework that had become central to her identity. Violence was a last resort, to be used only when all other options had been exhausted and only when the threat was immediate and serious. Starting a fight at school would mean suspension, possibly expulsion, and the consequences would ripple through every aspect of her life like stones thrown into still water. It would disappoint her mother, who had already sacrificed so much financially to keep Delphine in school after the divorce had destroyed their family's economic stability. The legal battles had consumed most of their savings, and her mother's non-profit salary barely covered their basic living expenses. A suspension would require time away from work that they couldn't afford, and expulsion might force them to consider even more dramatic changes to their living situation. More importantly, Fighting would prove that she was just another violent student who couldn't handle conflict appropriately, someone who resorted to physical force when faced with social challenges. She had seen how quickly school administrators made assumptions about kids who got into fights, regardless of circumstances or provocation. One incident could follow her for years, affecting college applications, scholarship opportunities, and job prospects. The permanent record would become a scarlet letter that she could never escape. But the real reason Delphine held back was more complex and more personal. She had seen what violence could do to a person's soul, had watched her uncle struggle with the aggression that had made him successful in the ring, but destructive in his personal relationships. The same intensity that had driven him to compete at the highest levels of professional fighting had also contributed to the end of 2 marriages and estrangement from several family members. Marcus had been honest with her about these struggles, explaining how the mindset that made someone effective in combat could become toxic in normal social interactions. He had described the difficulty of turning off the hypervigilance and aggressive responses that were necessary for fighting, the challenge of interacting normally with people when you were constantly assessing them as potential threats. The psychological conditioning that created effective fighters could create damaged human beings if it wasn't carefully controlled and channeled. Delphine was terrified of what she might become if she let that part of herself loose in anger. The control she maintained wasn't just about avoiding trouble, it was about maintaining her identity as someone fundamentally different from her tormentors. She had seen the darkness that lived inside people who chose violence as their primary means of solving problems, and she was determined not to become another casualty of that seductive but destructive path. The irony wasn't lost on her that her greatest strength had become a source of weakness in this environment. All those years of training, all that knowledge and skill, rendered useless by her own moral code and the institutional systems that consistently failed to protect her. She was like a master swordsman who had chosen to live in a world where weapons were forbidden, watching helplessly as lesser fighters dominated through crude aggression and institutional protection. The philosophical framework that Marcus had taught her emphasized that true martial artists used their skills only when absolutely necessary, only when failure to act would result in serious harm to themselves or others. This wasn't that situation, at least not yet. Troy and his friends were cruel and psychologically damaging, but they hadn't crossed the line into physical assault that would justify a violent response. But the daily erosion of her dignity and self-worth was taking a toll that she was only beginning to understand. She found herself having difficulty sleeping, lying awake at night replaying confrontations and imagining different outcomes. Her appetite had decreased significantly, and she had lost weight that she couldn't afford to lose. Most concerning, she was beginning to doubt herself in ways that had nothing to do with her tormentors, questioning her intelligence, her worth, and her basic competence in ways that suggested the psychological damage was spreading beyond the specific context of school harassment. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in late October, during the grey period of autumn when the days were growing shorter and the promise of winter was beginning to manifest in bare trees and cloudy skies. The school day had been typical in its awfulness, with Troy's group maintaining their usual pattern of low-level harassment and psychological warfare. Delphine had been particularly careful that day, taking alternate routes through the sprawling building and timing her movements to avoid the common areas where confrontations were most likely to occur. She thought she had made it through safely when she heard familiar laughter echoing from the main hallway near the administrative offices, the sound carrying clearly through the acoustics of the institutional architecture. The administrative wing of Jefferson High was designed to project authority and control, with wider hallways, better lighting, and displays of school achievements that were meant to impress visitors and remind students of the institution's standards and expectations. Principal Williams was walking toward her office, her arms full of folders and her usually perfectly composed appearance slightly disheveled from a long day of managing the complex logistics of running a school with over 2,000 students. Patricia Williams was one of the few adults at Jefferson who had earned genuine respect from both students and faculty through her combination of fairness, intelligence, and unwavering dedication to education. She had been principal for 8 years, having arrived at Jefferson with a reputation for turning around struggling schools and maintaining her success through consistent application of high standards and genuine care for student welfare. Patricia Williams was in her mid-40s, with graying brown hair that she wore in a professional style that managed to be both authoritative and approachable. Her clothing was always impeccable, reflecting both her professional standards and her understanding that appearance mattered in her role as the public face of the institution. She was one of the few adults in the building who had bothered to learn Delphine's real name, always greeting her warmly when they passed in the halls and occasionally checking in about her adjustment to Jefferson. These brief interactions had meant more to Delphine than Principal Williams probably realized. In a school where most adults were either indifferent or actively hostile, her simple courtesy and recognition had provided moments of humanity that helped sustain Delphine through the worst periods of harassment. She represented everything decent about Jefferson High, the thin line between civilization and chaos that made education possible despite the toxic social dynamics that plagued teenage environments. Troy, Jackson, and Becca were clustered near the main office, supposedly waiting to speak with the vice principal about some athletics matter, but their attention was focused entirely on Principal Williams as she struggled with her heavy load of paperwork and administrative materials. The documents represented hours of work on budgets, personnel evaluations, and curriculum planning, the invisible labor that made education possible but was rarely recognized or appreciated. The positioning of Troy's group was strategic, placing them in the perfect location to observe and potentially interfere with foot traffic in the administrative area. They had clearly been waiting for an opportunity, and Principal Williams' appearance, with her arms full of materials, created the perfect circumstances for the kind of calculated cruelty that had become their specialty. What happened next unfolded in horrible slow motion, each moment etched into Delphine's memory with the clarity that comes from witnessing something genuinely shocking. As Principal Williams passed their group, Troy deliberately stuck out his foot in a movement that was too smooth and purposeful to be anything other than premeditated. The positioning was perfect, catching her ankle at exactly the right moment to create maximum instability. She stumbled forward, her professional composure shattered as she fought to maintain her balance while protecting the documents in her arms. The folders scattered across the polished linoleum floor, months of careful work spreading in a chaos of loose papers and broken organization. But in trying to catch herself and protect her materials, her heel caught in the hem of her pencil skirt, and the fabric tore with a loud ripping sound that seemed to echo through the hallway like a gunshot. The hallway fell silent, except for Troy's delighted laughter, a sound that carried clearly through the sudden hush that had fallen over the dozen or so students who had witnessed the incident. Principal Williams stood frozen, her professional dignity shattered as her torn skirt exposed more than was appropriate for a school setting. Her face flushed deep red with humiliation and anger as she tried to hold the fabric together with one hand while gathering her scattered papers with the other, the impossible task highlighting her vulnerability and helplessness. The sight of this dignified professional woman reduced to such circumstances was shocking in its cruelty. Principal Williams had devoted her career to education, had spent countless hours working to create a positive environment for learning, and had treated every student with respect and fairness. To see her humiliated in such a calculated and public manner was devastating not just for her personally, but for everything she represented about the possibility of dignity and decency in an institutional setting. "Oops," Troy said loudly, his voice carrying down the hallway with theatrical innocence. "Guess you should watch where you're going, Principal Williams. Maybe invest in some better clothes while you're at it." The comment was delivered with perfect timing, loud enough to ensure that every witness heard clearly, while maintaining the pretense of casual observation rather than deliberate cruelty. Jackson and Becca dissolved into giggles, their phones already out to capture photos of the dignified woman's humiliation. The speed with which they moved to document the incident revealed that this had been planned, that they had anticipated the opportunity to create viral content from someone else's suffering. Their devices clicked and whirred as they captured images from multiple angles, ensuring that Principal Williams' humiliation would be preserved and distributed throughout the school's social networks. Other students in the hallway stood paralyzed, unsure whether to help or pretend they hadn't witnessed anything. The administrative area was typically busy during this time of day, with students arriving for after-school appointments and staff members completing end-of-day tasks. The presence of so many witnesses made the incident more humiliating for Principal Williams, while simultaneously making intervention more complicated for potential helpers. Something fundamental shifted inside Delphine as she watched the scene unfold, like a dam breaking after years of accumulated pressure. The sight of Principal Williams, one of the few adults who had shown her genuine kindness, being subjected to the same casual cruelty that had defined her own experience at Jefferson, was more than she could tolerate. This wasn't just another example of Troy's bullying. This was an attack on the basic principles of human decency and respect that made civilization possible. Principal Williams wasn't just another victim of Troy's cruelty. She was an adult, an authority figure, someone who had dedicated her life to education and had shown Delphine kindness when no one else would. More than that, she represented everything decent about Jefferson High, the thin line between civilization and chaos that Troy had just crossed with calculated malice. The attack wasn't just personal. It was an assault on the very idea that people should be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their position or vulnerability. The calculated nature of the attack was what truly enraged Delphine. This wasn't impulsive cruelty or teenage stupidity. This was a deliberate assault on a woman's dignity, planned and executed for maximum humiliation. Troy had waited for the perfect moment when the hallway was crowded with witnesses, when Principal Williams was most vulnerable with her arms full of documents. He had orchestrated this moment of degradation with the same careful attention he brought to planning his football plays, treating human suffering as entertainment to be optimized for maximum impact. As Delphine watched the dignified woman struggle to maintain her composure while holding together her torn clothing, something inside her crystallized with perfect clarity. This was exactly why bullies like Troy needed to be stopped, why the cycle of cruelty had to be broken before it consumed everything decent in its path. It was never enough for them to target other students. Their cruelty would always escalate, always find new victims, always push boundaries until someone finally pushed back with sufficient force to make them reconsider their choices. The realization struck her with the force of revelation. Her uncle's teachings about control and restraint had a corollary that she had never fully understood. Sometimes the most controlled action was decisive intervention. Sometimes allowing cruelty to continue unchallenged was itself a form of violence, a passive participation in the destruction of human dignity. Sometimes the most disciplined choice was to act. Without conscious thought, Delphine found herself moving forward, her training taking over in a way that felt both foreign and completely natural. Her backpack hit the polished floor with a heavy thud that seemed to echo through the sudden silence like a gunshot, the sound marking a moment of transition that everyone present would remember for years to come. Students instinctively stepped back as something in her demeanor changed completely, as if a different person had suddenly inhabited her body. The transformation was so complete and immediate that several students who had known her for months didn't immediately recognize her. Gone was the hunched posture and nervous energy that had defined her presence at Jefferson since her arrival. Her spine straightened with military precision, her shoulders squared with the confident bearing of someone who knew exactly how dangerous they were and had finally decided to stop hiding it. Her movements took on the predatory grace that Marcus had drilled into her over 8 years of intensive training, each step flowing into the next with the fluid efficiency of a natural athlete in perfect condition. This was the real Delphine, the one who had been hiding behind oversized sweaters and self-imposed silence for months. This was the young woman who could disable multiple attackers with clinical efficiency, who had spent thousands of hours perfecting techniques that most people would never even attempt to learn. This was the student of Marcus Rodriguez, inheritor of fighting wisdom that had been refined over centuries of combat and tested in the most demanding arenas of human competition. "Troy," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hallway with a tone that made everyone freeze in place. There was something in her voice that was completely different from anything they had heard before. A quality of contained danger that spoke to primitive survival instincts that existed below conscious thought. It wasn't the voice of a scared victim anymore. It was the voice of someone who had finally decided that enough was enough. Troy turned toward her, his confident grin faltering slightly as he processed the change in her bearing and tone. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his features as his brain struggled to reconcile this confident, dangerous-looking young woman with the timid victim he had been tormenting for months. But his need to maintain face in front of his audience quickly reasserted itself. Well, look who finally decided to speak up. What's wrong, Mouse? Getting brave all of a sudden?" The words came out with his usual arrogant confidence, but there was something forced about his delivery, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as his audience that the situation was still under his control. Delphine moved closer, her steps measured and purposeful, each movement flowing into the next with the kind of mechanical precision that came from thousands of hours of practice. The distance between them decreased with each step, and Troy found himself unconsciously backing away from something he couldn't quite identify, but that triggered every survival instinct he possessed. "You're going to apologize to Principal Williams, right now." The words were delivered quietly, but with absolute conviction, carrying the weight of someone who was prepared to enforce their demands through whatever means became necessary. The hallway erupted in nervous laughter from students who couldn't quite process what they were witnessing. The idea that Mouse, the quiet victim who had endured months of harassment without resistance, was now confronting Troy Brennan in front of a crowd of witnesses seemed so impossible that the only response was uncomfortable hilarity. Troy's confidence returned as he realized his audience was still watching and that his reputation was on the line. In his mind, this was just another opportunity to assert dominance, another chance to remind everyone who really controlled the social dynamics at Jefferson High. The possibility that he might actually be in danger never seriously occurred to him. Or what? What are you going to do about it, Mouse? The question was delivered with theatrical confidence, his voice projecting clearly to ensure that every witness could hear his dismissal of her threat. "I'm going to show you what happens when you pick the wrong person to mess with," Delphine said quietly, her voice carrying a promise that sent chills through everyone present. Troy stepped forward, clearly expecting her to back down as she always had before. His confidence bolstered by months of successful intimidation and the presence of witnesses who had consistently validated his dominance. In his mind, this was just another performance, another opportunity to demonstrate his power over someone weaker. The possibility that the dynamics had fundamentally shifted never occurred to him until it was far too late. "You think you're tough now? You're still just a scared little—" He never finished the sentence. Delphine's right hand shot forward in a perfect straight punch that caught him square in the solar plexus, delivered with textbook precision and just enough force to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. The strike was the product of 8 years of intensive training, thousands of repetitions that had burned the movement into her muscle memory until it could be executed without conscious thought. The technique was flawless. Her feet were positioned perfectly for maximum power transfer. Her hip rotation provided additional force that doubled the impact. Her fist connected with the exact pressure point that Marcus had taught her to target, the solar plexus nerve cluster that would cause immediate paralysis of the diaphragm. The strike was so fast that most observers didn't even see it happen. One moment Troy was sneering confidently, the next he was doubled over, gasping for air as his face turned red and his eyes watered uncontrollably. Before he could even begin to recover, before his brain could process what had happened to him, Delphine grabbed his extended wrist with both hands and twisted, using his own forward momentum against him in a classic Aikido technique that her uncle had taught her during her 3rd year of training. The leverage was perfect, exploiting Troy's weight and aggressive posture to create a throw that required minimal strength but produced maximum results. Troy found himself spinning helplessly through the air, his 180-pound frame moving with the same helplessness as a child's toy, before crashing into the nearest bank of lockers with a resounding clang that echoed through the hallway like a bell. The impact was loud enough to make several students jump, and Troy slumped against the metal surface, still struggling to breathe and now dealing with the additional trauma of having been thrown like a rag doll. The sound of his body hitting the lockers reverberated through the hallway, a metallic crash that seemed to hang in the air long after the actual impact had ended. Students who had witnessed countless fights and confrontations later said they had never heard anything quite like it, the sound of absolute dominance being asserted through superior skill and technique. Jackson rushed forward to help his friend, his basketball player reflexes and 6'4" frame giving him confidence that he could handle one small girl, regardless of what had just happened to Troy. But his athletic background had provided him with no preparation for facing someone with actual combat training, and his movements telegraphed his intentions as clearly as if he had announced them over the school's public address system. Delphine read his movement like an open book, recognizing the clumsy, telegraphed tackle attempt before he had even fully committed to it. Her years of sparring against opponents of every size and skill level had taught her to recognize and counter every type of attack, and Jackson's crude charge was almost insultingly easy to defend against. She sidestepped his charge with minimal effort, her feet moving in the precise pattern that Marcus had drilled into her thousands of times during their training sessions. The movement was so smooth and economical that it looked almost effortless, like a dancer avoiding a clumsy partner rather than a fighter defending against an attack. As Jackson stumbled past her, his momentum carrying him beyond his target, Delphine grabbed his shirt with both hands and executed a textbook hip throw that would have made her uncle proud. The technique was perfect in its execution, using Jackson's own forward momentum and his greater height against him in a demonstration of leverage and timing that was almost educational in its clarity. Jackson flew over her hip with a trajectory that was as predictable as it was devastating, his long limbs sprawling awkwardly as he hit the polished hallway floor with an impact that knocked the wind out of him completely. The sound of his body hitting the linoleum was different from Troy's collision with the lockers, a dull thud that spoke to the unforgiving nature of the institutional flooring. He lay there struggling to understand what had just happened to him, his brain unable to process how someone half his size had thrown him through the air like he weighed nothing. The technique had been so efficient and controlled that he couldn't even identify what she had done to him. Only that one moment he had been charging forward with confidence, and the next he was sprawled on the floor with no clear memory of the transition. Becca screamed and raised her phone to record what she thought would be Delphine's inevitable humiliation, her cheerleader reflexes and social media instincts combining to create what she assumed would be viral content showing the mouse finally getting her comeuppance. But her assumption that she was safe from retaliation proved to be catastrophically wrong. Delphine was already moving toward her with the fluid grace of a natural fighter, her transition from dealing with Jackson to addressing Becca so smooth that it seemed like one continuous motion. The years of training had taught her to manage multiple opponents simultaneously, to maintain awareness of all threats while dealing with each one in turn. A quick, controlled strike to Becca's wrist sent the phone clattering across the floor, the device skidding under a nearby bench with a plastic scraping sound that marked the end of any photographic record of the confrontation. The strike was precisely calibrated to disable her ability to document the incident without causing lasting injury, another demonstration of the control and precision that separated trained fighters from street brawlers. The blow to her wrist was followed immediately by a perfectly executed foot sweep that put the cheerleader on the ground beside her friends, completing the dismantling of Troy's group in less than 30 seconds. Becca's legs went out from under her as smoothly as if someone had pulled a rug, and she found herself sitting on the floor with no clear understanding of how she had gotten there. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but to the witnesses, it felt like watching a masterclass in controlled violence. Delphine had dismantled 3 opponents with such efficiency and precision that it was almost artistic in its execution, like watching a craftsman demonstrate their mastery of a complex skill. Every movement had been purposeful, every technique perfectly executed, every decision calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum effort. Troy was slowly pulling himself up from the floor, his face a mask of shock and disbelief as he struggled to comprehend what had just happened to him. The confident sneer that had been his signature expression was gone, replaced by the kind of confusion that comes from having fundamental assumptions about reality suddenly shattered. Jackson was curled in a ball, holding his ribs and groaning, his basketball player's ego devastated by the ease with which he had been handled. Becca sat where she had fallen, staring up at Delphine with wide, frightened eyes that reflected a complete inability to process the transformation they had just witnessed. The hallway was completely silent, except for the heavy breathing of the 3 bullies and the subtle sounds of institutional ventilation that provided a constant background hum throughout Jefferson High. Every student stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The quiet, invisible girl they had all dismissed as weak and helpless had just dismantled the school's most feared bullies with clinical efficiency, demonstrating a level of skill and control that most of them had only seen in movies. The silence stretched on, broken only by Troy's labored breathing and the distant sounds of normal school activity from other parts of the building. Students who had witnessed countless teenage confrontations later said they had never seen anything like it. The combination of speed, precision, and controlled aggression that had turned a routine bullying incident into a demonstration of superior skill and training. Delphine stood over Troy, her breathing steady and controlled despite having just engaged in physical combat with 3 opponents. For a moment, she saw genuine fear in his eyes for the first time ever, the kind of terror that comes from realizing that all your assumptions about power and dominance have been completely wrong. She could see that he was vulnerable, beaten, humiliated in front of the entire school. One more strike could put him down completely, could give him a taste of the helplessness he had forced her to feel every day for months. The temptation was real and immediate. Every day of harassment, every moment of humiliation, every time he had called her mouse and treated her like something less than human could be paid back with interest. She had the power to hurt him badly, to make him understand what it felt like to be completely helpless while others watched and did nothing. The justice of it was undeniable, and the satisfaction would be immediate and complete. Instead, she stepped back and extended her hand toward Principal Williams, who was still clutching her torn skirt and staring in amazement at the transformation she had just witnessed. The gesture was simple but profound, a conscious choice to focus on helping rather than hurting, on building rather than destroying. "Are you all right, Mrs. Williams?" The question was asked with genuine concern, as if the previous 30 seconds of violence had been nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to a normal conversation. The principal took the offered hand gratefully, allowing Delphine to help her to her feet with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the devastating efficiency she had just demonstrated against her tormentors. Yes, thank you, Delphine. That was..." She paused, searching for words adequate to describe what she had just witnessed. "That was very brave of you." The simple acknowledgement meant more to Delphine than any amount of praise or recognition could have. Principal Williams had used her real name, had recognized her as a person worthy of respect and gratitude. After months of being called Mouse and treated like something less than human, the restoration of her identity was almost as satisfying as the physical victory she had just achieved. Troy finally managed to stand up straight, his face flushed with anger and humiliation, as he struggled to reassert some measure of control over a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his management. The public nature of his defeat was as devastating as the physical aspects, and his need to save face was overwhelming his better judgment. "You're going to pay for this, Mouse. You think this is over?" The threat was delivered with as much confidence as he could muster, but there was something hollow about it, a quality of desperation that everyone present could hear clearly. Delphine turned to face him calmly, her posture relaxed but ready, her expression showing no fear or uncertainty. "My name is Delphine, and yes, this is over. All of it." The conviction in her voice seemed to drain the fight out of him completely, like air escaping from a punctured balloon. The use of her real name was significant, a declaration that she was reclaiming her identity and would no longer tolerate being diminished or dehumanized. The quiet confidence with which she delivered the statement carried more authority than any threat could have, making it clear that the previous dynamic between them had been permanently altered. Troy looked around at the crowd of students staring at him, no longer with the fear or respect that had sustained his position in the school's hierarchy, but with the kind of fascination people reserved for watching someone's complete downfall. He had been exposed as a coward who only picked on those he thought couldn't fight back, and the witnesses to his humiliation would ensure that news of his defeat spread throughout the school within hours. The social dynamics that had made him powerful were now working against him with devastating efficiency. His reputation had been built on the perception of strength and dominance, and that foundation had been completely destroyed in less than 30 seconds. The same students who had laughed at his jokes and enabled his cruelty would now be gossiping about his defeat, and his fall from grace would be as swift and merciless as his rise to power had been calculated and cruel. "Come on," he muttered to Jackson and Becca, both of whom were slowly getting to their feet with movements that suggested ongoing pain and disorientation. "Let's get out of here." The retreat was as public as the confrontation had been, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing the end of an era at Jefferson High. As the three of them limped away, their departure marked by whispered conversations and pointing fingers, the crowd began to disperse, with students whispering excitedly about what they had witnessed. But several remained, looking at Delphine with a new kind of respect that was mixed with awe and perhaps a touch of healthy fear. The transformation they had witnessed was so complete that many were still struggling to process it. Among those who remained was Ryan Castellanos, a quiet boy from her chemistry class who had always seemed kind but had never spoken to her directly. He was one of those students who existed in the middle tier of Jefferson's social hierarchy, neither popular enough to be protected nor different enough to be targeted. His dark hair and thoughtful expression had caught Delphine's attention several times during their shared class. But the social barriers that kept victims isolated had prevented any meaningful interaction. He approached cautiously, his expression mixing admiration with concern as he struggled to find words adequate to the situation. "That was incredible," he said softly, his voice carrying genuine awe. "I've wanted to do something about Troy for months, but I never—" He trailed off, shaking his head as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than the kind of prurient interest that might have come from other students. Delphine smiled for the first time in weeks, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was carrying. The expression transformed her face completely, revealing the intelligent, confident young woman who had been hiding beneath months of fear and isolation. "My uncle owns a gym. He's been training me since I was 10. Why didn't you ever fight back before?" The question hung in the air as Delphine considered her answer, weighing the complex motivations that had kept her from acting despite months of provocation. "Because I wanted to be better than them. I didn't want to become the kind of person who solves problems with violence." She glanced toward where Troy's group had disappeared, their retreat marking the end of their reign of terror. But sometimes people need to understand that their actions have consequences. The philosophical framework that had guided her decision-making was something she had never articulated before, but speaking it aloud helped her understand her own motivations more clearly. The months of restraint hadn't been weakness. They had been a conscious choice to maintain her moral identity even under extreme provocation. But there was also a point beyond which restraint became enablement, and Troy's attack on Principal Williams had clearly crossed that line. Principal Williams had managed to tie her jacket around her waist to cover the tear in her skirt, restoring some measure of professional dignity to her appearance. She approached Delphine with a complex expression, clearly torn between gratitude for the intervention and her responsibility to address the violence that had just occurred in her school's hallway. "Delphine, I need you to come with me to my office," she said gently, her tone suggesting concern rather than accusation. "We need to discuss what just happened." The invitation was delivered with the kind of careful diplomacy that acknowledged the complexity of the situation while maintaining the institutional requirements of her position. Delphine nodded, understanding that there would be consequences even for justified self-defense. The school's zero-tolerance policies regarding violence made no exceptions for circumstances or provocation, and she had known when she chose to act that she would face disciplinary action regardless of the justification for her behavior. But as they walked toward the administrative wing, she noticed something that made her smile despite the potential consequences she was facing. Students were stepping aside respectfully, many nodding or offering quiet words of support that acknowledged what she had done for all of them. The whispers that followed her weren't cruel anymore. They were impressed, even awed, carrying a respect that she had never experienced during her time at Jefferson. "Thank you," one girl whispered as they passed, her voice barely audible but her gratitude unmistakable. "He did the same thing to my sister last year." The comment revealed that Troy's pattern of behavior had been more extensive than Delphine had realized, and that her intervention had been appreciated by victims she hadn't even known existed. Other students offered similar acknowledgements, brief expressions of gratitude that suggested the impact of Troy's reign of terror had been far more widespread than anyone had been willing to admit. The conspiracy of silence that had protected him was beginning to break down, and students who had been afraid to speak up were finding their voices in the aftermath of his very public defeat. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic at Jefferson High shifted dramatically in ways that surprised everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. Troy and his friends seemed to shrink into themselves, no longer strutting through the hallways with their previous arrogance and casual cruelty. They avoided Delphine completely, crossing to the other side of hallways when they saw her approaching and timing their movements to minimize any chance of accidental encounters. More importantly, their bullying of other students decreased noticeably as word spread about what happened when they picked the wrong target. The incident had been recorded by several students despite Becca's failed attempt to document it, and the footage had spread through social media with viral speed. But rather than glorifying violence, the video sparked conversations about bullying, standing up for others, and the failure of adults to protect vulnerable students. The conversations that emerged from the incident were more sophisticated and nuanced than anyone had expected. Students began discussing the difference between aggression and self-defense, the responsibility of bystanders to intervene when they witnessed cruelty, and the institutional failures that allowed harassment to flourish unchecked. These discussions were happening in classrooms, cafeterias, and social media platforms, creating a cultural shift that extended far beyond the specific incident that had triggered it. Delphine found herself reluctantly famous, but she used the attention to advocate for better anti-bullying policies and support systems for vulnerable students. Her newfound visibility gave her a platform that she used responsibly, speaking to administrators about the systematic failures that had allowed Troy's behavior to continue unchecked, and working with other students to create peer support networks that could intervene before situations escalated to violence. The recognition was gratifying, but more importantly, other students began standing up for themselves and each other in ways that created lasting change. The culture of silent complicity that had allowed bullying to flourish was replaced by something healthier, a community where intervention was expected and isolation was actively countered. Students who had been targets found their voices, and bystanders became more willing to intervene when they saw others being mistreated. This cultural transformation was perhaps the most significant outcome of the confrontation. The incident had served as a catalyst for broader changes that made Jefferson High a more humane place for everyone. Teachers reported fewer disciplinary problems, counselors noted decreased reports of depression and anxiety among students, and the overall atmosphere of the school improved in measurable ways. Delphine found herself with friends for the first time at Jefferson, a social circle that formed organically around shared experiences and mutual respect. Ryan had become a close companion, and their friendship had blossomed into something deeper as they spent time together studying and talking about their shared experiences of feeling invisible at school. She learned that he had been writing poetry in secret, just as she had been hiding her martial arts training, and their mutual understanding of the need to conceal important aspects of themselves created a bond that was both immediate and lasting. Their relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on genuine compatibility rather than social convenience or mutual desperation. They discovered shared interests in literature, science, and social justice that provided endless topics for conversation. More importantly, they understood each other's experiences of isolation and marginalization in ways that created deep empathy and mutual support. The disciplinary hearing had resulted in a 3-day suspension for fighting, a consequence that Delphine accepted without complaint or appeal. Principal Williams had made it clear that she understood the circumstances, but institutional requirements demanded consistent application of disciplinary policies regardless of context or justification. "I don't condone violence," she had told Delphine privately during their meeting in her office, "but I also can't condone the systematic harassment you endured. Sometimes the system fails, and people have to protect themselves. The acknowledgement was as close to an endorsement as she could provide while maintaining her professional responsibilities, and it meant more to Delphine than any official recognition could have. The suspension itself became a strange form of recognition, with students understanding that she was being punished for defending not just herself, but the principles of human dignity that made their school community possible. The disciplinary action that should have stigmatized her instead became a symbol of her willingness to accept consequences for doing what was right. Troy had also been suspended, not just for the incident with Principal Williams, but for the pattern of bullying behavior that finally came to light when other students felt safe enough to report it. The investigation that followed revealed months of harassment directed at multiple targets, creating a documented history of misconduct that had previously been invisible to administrators. His athletic eligibility was suspended pending a comprehensive review that would ultimately result in his removal from the football team. The broader investigation revealed the extent to which Troy's group had terrorized vulnerable students throughout the school, creating a systematic pattern of abuse that had been carefully concealed from adult oversight. Students who had been afraid to report incidents finally felt safe enough to come forward, and the accumulated evidence painted a picture of deliberate cruelty that shocked even experienced administrators. The consequences for Troy extended far beyond school discipline. His college recruitment, which had been based largely on his athletic performance and leadership potential, evaporated as word of his behavior spread through coaching networks. The carefully constructed image of himself as a leader and role model was permanently destroyed, and his future plans had to be completely reconsidered. As Delphine sat in her uncle's gym several weeks later, working through her training routine with renewed focus and purpose, she reflected on how much had changed in her life and in her understanding of herself. The familiar environment of heavy bags, speed bags, and training mats provided a sense of continuity and grounding that helped her process the dramatic changes that had occurred. The gym remained exactly as it had always been, a sanctuary where skill and dedication were the only currencies that mattered. The smell of leather and sweat, the rhythmic percussion of training equipment, and the focused intensity of serious athletes created an atmosphere that was both demanding and supportive. This was where she had learned not just to fight, but to understand herself and her capabilities. She had learned that sometimes being strong meant knowing when to hold back, exercising restraint and control even under extreme provocation. But it also meant knowing when to stand up, when to draw lines that could not be crossed without consequences. The real strength hadn't been in the techniques she used to defend herself. It had been in maintaining her principles even while refusing to be victimized. The philosophical balance between restraint and action was something she would continue to explore and refine throughout her life. The incident at Jefferson had taught her that moral principles required both wisdom and courage to implement effectively, that knowing what was right was meaningless without the will to act when action was necessary. "You did good, kid," her uncle said, watching her practice her forms with the critical eye of an experienced trainer. "You used exactly the right amount of force to stop the threat without going too far. That's what real martial arts is about, control, not destruction." His approval meant more to her than any recognition she had received at school, coming from someone who understood both the technical and ethical aspects of what she had accomplished. Marcus had been particularly proud of her restraint, the way she had stopped short of seriously injuring her opponents despite having the skill and opportunity to do much worse. The difference between a trained martial artist and a street brawler was precisely this ability to calibrate force appropriately, to achieve necessary objectives without causing unnecessary harm. Delphine smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones like wisdom that would guide her for the rest of her life. She had found her voice and her strength, not by becoming like her tormentors, but by refusing to let them define who she was or what she could become. At Jefferson High, she was no longer invisible, but more importantly, she was finally, truly herself. The transformation was complete and permanent. The quiet, frightened girl who had transferred to Jefferson months earlier no longer existed, replaced by a confident young woman who understood her own worth and was prepared to defend it when necessary. She had learned to balance the competing demands of moral restraint and personal protection, finding a path that honored both her principles and her dignity. The experience had taught her that strength came in many forms, that the most important battles were often fought not with fists, but with character, and that sometimes the most powerful action was knowing when not to act. But it had also taught her that there were lines that should not be crossed, principles that were worth defending, and moments when action was not just justified, but morally required. As she worked through her training routine, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of her uncle's gym, Delphine understood that she had found something more valuable than fighting skills or social acceptance. She had found herself, complete and uncompromising, ready to face whatever challenges life might bring, with the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she stood for.